When Dershowitz questioned Crockett's legal qualifications on national television, he had no idea she was about to expose his own legal failures with devastating precision. The CNN studios in Manhattan were bustling with the usual pre-show energy as producers prepared for Anderson Cooper 360's special legal panel discussion. The topic: constitutional challenges to recent federal legislation. The panel featured some of the most prominent legal minds in America, including Harvard Law School professor emeritus Alan Dershowitz and Representative Jasmine Crockett. Dershowitz, now 85, carried himself with the supreme confidence of someone who had spent decades as one of America's most famous defense attorneys. His resume included defending celebrities, presidents, and controversial figures, and he never let anyone forget his Harvard pedigree. He sat at the curved desk reviewing his notes, occasionally glancing at the other panelists with the air of someone who considered himself the most qualified person in the room. Representative Crockett took her position at the panel desk with her characteristic calm composure. She had prepared extensively for the discussion, bringing case files and constitutional references, knowing that television legal panels often devolved into shouting matches rather than substantive legal analysis. Anderson Cooper opened the segment with his typical professional demeanor. "We're discussing the constitutional implications of the latest federal voting rights legislation. Professor Dershowitz, let's start with your perspective on the Commerce Clause challenges." Dershowitz leaned forward, clearly relishing the opportunity to display his expertise. "Anderson, what we're seeing here is a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law by politicians who lack the proper legal training to comprehend these complex issues." He gestured dismissively in Crockett's direction without looking directly at her. "We have members of Congress making sweeping statements about constitutional interpretation when they simply don't have the academic background or practical experience to understand the nuances involved." Crockett raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, allowing Dershowitz to continue digging his own grave. "The Commerce Clause jurisprudence requires a sophisticated understanding of Supreme Court precedent dating back to the Marshall Court," Dershowitz continued, his voice carrying the condescending tone of a professor lecturing undergraduates. "You can't just graduate from some regional law school and think you understand constitutional law." Anderson Cooper shifted uncomfortably, sensing the personal nature of the attack. "Professor, are you referring specifically to Representative Crockett's qualifications?" Dershowitz finally looked directly at Crockett, his expression showing barely concealed disdain. "I'm simply saying that constitutional law is not something you learn in a few years of criminal defense practice. It requires decades of academic study, Supreme Court experience, and constitutional scholarship." He paused dramatically, clearly enjoying what he believed was his intellectual dominance of the panel. "Representative Crockett may be well-intentioned, but she's simply not qualified to debate constitutional interpretation with serious legal scholars." The studio fell silent. Camera operators exchanged glances, recognizing they were witnessing a potentially explosive moment. Crockett's expression remained perfectly composed, but her eyes sharpened with surgical precision. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I appreciate your assessment of my qualifications. Before I respond to your constitutional analysis, I'd like to address your recent legal work, since you've made experience and credibility the focus of this discussion." Dershowitz's confident smirk began to fade as he realized Crockett wasn't going to accept his dismissal quietly. "You mentioned Supreme Court experience," Crockett continued, consulting her notes with professional precision. "Let's examine your recent constitutional arguments. In Trump versus Thompson, you argued that executive privilege should shield presidential communications from congressional investigation. The Supreme Court rejected that argument 8-1. Dershowitz's face began to show the first signs of discomfort. That case involved complex separation of powers issues. In Trump's second impeachment trial, Crockett interrupted smoothly, you argued that a president cannot be impeached after leaving office. Legal scholars across the political spectrum, including conservative constitutional experts, called that argument historically and constitutionally baseless. Anderson Cooper leaned forward, recognizing that the dynamic of the panel had completely shifted. Legal analysts watching from the newsroom began taking notes frantically. Furthermore, Crockett pressed on, Your argument that abuse of power isn't impeachable unless it violates criminal statutes contradicts the clear text of the Constitution and 200 years of impeachment precedent, including your own previous positions. Dershowitz attempted to interrupt, but Crockett's legal training allowed her to maintain control of the argument. You also argued that presidents have absolute immunity for official acts during the classified documents case. That position was so extreme that even Trump's other attorneys distanced themselves from it. The cameras captured Dershowitz's expression as it shifted from condescension to genuine concern about where Crockett's systematic breakdown was heading. "Professor, you question my qualifications based on my law school and experience," Crockett said, her voice gaining strength. "But let's talk about your recent track record. In how many of these high-profile constitutional cases have your arguments been accepted by federal courts?" Dershowitz looked toward Anderson Cooper as if seeking rescue from the host, but Cooper remained neutral, allowing the legal debate to continue. "I'll answer that for you," Crockett continued. 0. Your constitutional arguments in Trump-related cases have been rejected by every federal court that heard them, including courts with Trump-appointed judges. She pulled out another document from her prepared materials. The D.C. Circuit called your executive privilege arguments legally frivolous. The Supreme Court declined to hear your immunity arguments because they lacked constitutional merit. Dershowitz's legendary confidence was visibly cracking. Those courts were influenced by political considerations. "Professor," Crockett cut him off with devastating precision, "you just accused federal judges, including conservative Republican appointees, of making decisions based on politics rather than law. That's exactly the kind of reckless rhetoric that undermines public confidence in our judicial system." Anderson Cooper was struggling to maintain his professional composure as he watched one of America's most famous attorneys being systematically dismantled by a congresswoman he had just dismissed as unqualified. "Now, regarding the Commerce Clause analysis you mentioned," Crockett continued, transitioning seamlessly from attacking Dershowitz's credibility to demonstrating her own expertise. "The voting rights legislation draws its authority not just from the Commerce Clause, but primarily from the 15th Amendment's enforcement power." She cited specific Supreme Court cases with the fluency of someone who had studied constitutional law extensively. In South Carolina v. Katzenbach, the court established that Section 2 of the 15th Amendment grants Congress broad remedial powers to address voting discrimination. Dershowitz sat in stunned silence, completely unprepared for the depth of Crockett's constitutional knowledge. The enforcement power established in cases like Katzenbach, Morgan, and Bourne provides clear precedent for congressional action on voting rights, Crockett explained with professorial authority. "Your Commerce Clause objection ignores the specific constitutional text and Supreme Court precedent governing voting rights enforcement." She looked directly at Dershowitz, her expression showing no mercy for his earlier condescension. "Professor, with all due respect, your analysis suggests you're either unfamiliar with voting rights jurisprudence or you're deliberately mischaracterizing the constitutional foundation for this legislation." The legal experts watching from CNN's newsroom were furiously typing, recognizing they were witnessing a masterclass in constitutional law advocacy. Furthermore, Crockett pressed her advantage, your suggestion that regional law schools don't provide adequate constitutional training reveals a prejudice that's inconsistent with legal reality. Some of the most significant civil rights attorneys in American history graduated from historically black law schools, including Thurgood Marshall. Dershowitz looked genuinely shaken, his Harvard supremacist worldview challenged in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. Crockett delivered her final blow. "Professor, I notice you haven't actually addressed the constitutional merits of the voting rights legislation. Instead, you attacked my qualifications and made unsupported claims about Commerce Clause jurisdiction. Is this the level of analysis Harvard Law School teaches?" Dershowitz attempted one last desperate defense. "Representative, you're taking my legal arguments out of context." "Context?" Crockett interrupted with surgical precision. "Professor, your own law review articles from the 1990s contradict the positions you've taken in recent years. You once wrote that executive privilege has clear limits and cannot shield criminal conduct, yet you argued the opposite for President Trump. She pulled out a highlighted copy of his academic work. In your 1998 Stanford Law Review piece, you explicitly stated that no president is above the law. How do you reconcile that scholarship with your recent absolute immunity arguments? The contradiction was devastating and undeniable. Legal experts in the CNN newsroom were already pulling up Dershowitz's old academic writings to verify Crockett's citations. Anderson Cooper called for a commercial break as Dershowitz sat speechless, his reputation as a constitutional expert in tatters. The cameras captured his stunned expression as legal analysts began tweeting about witnessing the complete destruction of Alan Dershowitz's credibility. During the break, Dershowitz's usual bravado was nowhere to be found. He spoke quietly with producers, clearly shaken by the systematic dismantling of both his recent legal work and his academic arrogance. When the show returned, Dershowitz was notably subdued, offering only brief defensive responses while Crockett continued to demonstrate her mastery of constitutional law and federal court precedent. Within hours, #Crockett Destroyed Dershowitz was trending on social media. Legal scholars praised Crockett's preparation and her devastating takedown of Dershowitz's recent legal failures. Law students began sharing clips of the confrontation as an example of how superior preparation and knowledge triumph over academic arrogance. The incident marked a significant moment in legal television, demonstrating that expertise and preparation matter more than prestigious credentials when facing someone who has done the homework. Dershowitz's attempt to dismiss Crockett based on academic snobbery had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own recent professional failures and undermining his credibility as a constitutional expert. Crockett had proven that real legal expertise comes from rigorous preparation and deep understanding of the law, not from Harvard pedigree and television fame.